A peaceful suburban neighborhood is rocked when a racist neighbor begins spreading malicious lies about a black family that just moved in. The accusations are harsh, accusing them of causing trouble and not respecting the neighborhood, despite the family doing nothing wrong. As these lies spread, the community begins to turn against the family, casting them out without any real evidence. But just when it seems like the lies will win, the family stands up for themselves. What happens next will not only expose the truth, but also show how quickly karma can strike when racism is confronted head-on. In the heart of a well-kept suburban neighborhood, a new family moved into a beautiful home at the end of the block. They were excited about new beginnings and becoming a part of the community. The black family, consisting of a father, mother, and 2 teenagers, had recently relocated from the city for a fresh start in a quieter environment. They had worked hard to get where they were, and their dreams of peace and opportunity seemed within reach. The family was warm, friendly, and eager to make new friends. On their first day, they introduced themselves to the neighbors with a smile, hoping to build connections and integrate into their new surroundings. They were well-mannered, respectful, and hoped to be accepted into the neighborhood, which appeared to be predominantly white. Everyone greeted them with politeness, but it wasn't long before things began to change. As the family settled in, a neighbor who lived 2 houses down began to take notice. He was a middle-aged man, a longtime resident of the neighborhood, and he'd been known for his strong opinions about who belonged and who didn't. His name was Greg, and it didn't take long for the family to realize that there was something off about him. At first, his comments seemed harmless, discussions about the weather, small talk over the fence. But slowly, Greg started making veiled remarks that felt more pointed. Greg was the type of person who held deep-seated biases, and the family soon found out that these biases went beyond just casual judgment. He began to spread rumors about them, whispering behind their backs to other neighbors. He told anyone who would listen that the new family wasn't the right fit for the neighborhood. Greg subtly planted the idea that they weren't good people, falsely accusing them of things like not taking care of their yard, which simply wasn't true. This was just the beginning. What started as a few whispers behind closed doors soon escalated into full-blown accusations. Greg began telling people that the family was causing trouble, stirring up trouble that no one had witnessed. His claims were vague, designed to make others suspicious without offering any real evidence. And as Greg's lies spread, it didn't take long before a handful of neighbors started distancing themselves, not because they knew the family, but because they were influenced by Greg's words. The black family, still hopeful and unaware of the brewing storm, continued to reach out to their neighbors. They waved hello, invited people over, and tried to get involved with neighborhood activities. But the more they tried, the more they felt an invisible barrier grow between them and the people they thought they could trust. Greg's lies began to paint them as outsiders, people who didn't belong and shouldn't be there. His whispers poisoned the air, and soon it seemed as though the entire neighborhood was following his lead, judging the family without ever truly getting to know them. The first signs of trouble came when the family received a letter in the mail from the neighborhood association. It was a polite but stern reminder about maintaining the front lawn and ensuring the exterior of their house met the neighborhood standards. The family was taken aback. They had kept their yard well kept, and the house was in pristine condition. They couldn't understand what had triggered the letter, but the quiet tension that had been growing in the neighborhood now felt palpable. Days passed, and small things began to happen. A neighbor who had once waved hello no longer made eye contact. Another neighbor stopped by their house with a suggestion about how they could better blend in with the rest of the community. The subtle snubs were hard to ignore, but the family remained hopeful that it was all just a misunderstanding. They believed that the neighborhood would come to see who they were once they got to know them better. But the truth began to reveal itself when the rumors escalated further. Greg, who had been spreading the lies, now had more people on his side. The neighborhood began whispering about the family in hushed tones, their private conversations laced with suspicion. Some were starting to avoid them altogether, letting Greg's accusations take root without questioning the truth. The family noticed that invitations to neighborhood barbecues and gatherings began to stop coming their way. Things took a dramatic turn when the family decided to attend a local event at the park, hoping to finally break through the walls of suspicion. They thought it would be a great opportunity to meet more neighbors, to show that they were just like everyone else. But when they arrived, the cold stares from some of the attendees spoke volumes. They felt like outsiders in their own neighborhood, alienated without cause. One afternoon, the family decided to confront Greg. They couldn't understand why he was doing this. They had tried to be nothing but kind and respectful, yet he continued to spread lies about them. They knocked on his door, hoping to clear the air, but Greg's attitude was more hostile than they had expected. "Why don't you just stay in your own lane?" Greg sneered as he answered the door. "You're not a good fit for this neighborhood, and everyone knows it. You've made people uncomfortable." The family was stunned. The words hung in the air like a slap to the face, but they weren't prepared for the venom that Greg unleashed next. "I've seen your kind before. It's always the same, coming into neighborhoods, trying to change things, stirring up trouble. We don't want that here," Greg continued, his voice thick with malice. The family stood in stunned silence, hurt by his accusations, but determined not to let him see their anger. The mother of the family, holding back her emotions, simply said, "We don't want trouble. We want to live here peacefully, just like everyone else. You're wrong about us, Greg. We haven't done anything to deserve this." But Greg was relentless, his anger and prejudice fully exposed. "You can't change people's perceptions. You don't belong here. It's just the way it is." With those words, the family realized they had to take a stand. They couldn't let this hate-filled neighbor continue to poison the rest of the community. The lies, the accusations, and the bias were destroying everything they had worked so hard for. But rather than retaliating with anger, they decided to fight back with truth and dignity. The family began to document everything, every false accusation, every slanderous remark, and every action Greg took to undermine their presence in the neighborhood. They started reaching out to neighbors who hadn't yet fallen under Greg's spell, showing them the truth about who they really were. They shared their story, about the real reasons they had moved to the neighborhood, about their dedication to creating a positive environment, and about their desire to build lasting relationships in their new home. As they spoke up, something remarkable began to happen. More neighbors started to question Greg's lies. Some reached out to the family, asking if there was anything they could do to help. The neighborhood, though divided, began to see the truth slowly. People who had once been wary began to realize that they had been wrong to listen to the lies. And more importantly, they began to realize that Greg, the person who had been poisoning their perceptions, had been the one stirring up the division. The tension in the neighborhood had reached its breaking point. Greg's lies had spread so far that even the once pleasant interactions at the local park were now filled with cold stares. The family, however, had remained steadfast. They knew they couldn't allow Greg's actions to go unchallenged, not just for themselves but for the future of their family and the integrity of their new home. It was time to take action. One evening, the family decided to host a neighborhood gathering at their home. They sent out invitations to everyone, but most of the community had already been influenced by Greg's poison. It was clear that many weren't willing to show up, too afraid to get involved or too influenced by Greg's stories. But they hoped a few of the open-minded neighbors would come and that they could finally clear the air. When the evening arrived, the house felt empty. The guests who did show up were a handful of brave souls, neighbors who hadn't let the rumors sway their opinion. The atmosphere was tense but hopeful. Then, just as the event was getting underway, Greg showed up at the doorstep, his expression smug and filled with arrogance. He walked in, scanning the room, and without hesitation he opened his mouth. "What's all this?" he sneered. "Trying to buy your way into our hearts? You think one little party will make everyone forget how you've been causing problems in the neighborhood?" The family stood together, a united front. They had been prepared for this moment. The father of the family stepped forward and faced Greg squarely. "You've been spreading lies about us, Greg, telling people that we don't belong here, that we're troublemakers. You've painted us as something we're not. And tonight, we're going to set the record straight." His voice was calm but firm, carrying the authority of a person who had been wronged but would not allow himself to be diminished. Greg smirked. "Oh, please, you think a few nice words and a party are going to change everyone's minds?" He laughed, trying to belittle the family. "I've already told everyone what you're about, and they're not buying it. You're just trying to make yourself look better." But before Greg could continue, one of the neighbors who had recently gotten to know the family spoke up. "You've been lying, Greg," she said, her voice loud and clear. "You've been telling people things that aren't true. We've been listening, and we see what you're doing. You're trying to stir up trouble for no reason." A few more neighbors who had been sitting quietly nodded in agreement. The tension in the room shifted. People were beginning to realize that Greg's words weren't based on truth. They were based on hate. The mother of the family, who had been quietly listening, now stood up and addressed the crowd. "We moved here because we wanted to be part of this community. We've always believed in treating people with kindness and respect. We've done nothing wrong, and yet we've been made to feel like we don't belong. I want you all to understand that this isn't just about one person. It's about the kind of community we want to build. Do we want to live in a place where we judge people based on their race or their background? Or do we want to live in a community that values fairness, honesty, and respect?" Her words struck a chord with the group. The room fell silent for a moment as the neighbors reflected on what she had said. Greg, standing at the back of the room, looked visibly uncomfortable. He had expected his lies to go unchecked, but now he was facing something far more powerful than his petty slanders. He was facing the truth. "I've lived here for years," Greg sputtered, trying to regain control of the situation. "I've seen this happen before. I'm just trying to protect our neighborhood, that's all." But no one was listening to him anymore. The neighbors who had supported Greg in his lies now felt the weight of their own complicity. One by one, they started to speak out, telling Greg that they were no longer willing to back him up. "You've done nothing but spread hate," another neighbor said, her voice shaking with emotion. "This is a community, not a place for you to pit people against each other." The final blow came when one of the older neighbors, someone Greg had known for years, spoke up. "I've been wrong, too," he admitted. "I let Greg's lies influence me. I didn't know the truth, and I let myself be fooled. I'm sorry." The shame on Greg's face was palpable. He had been the cause of so much division, and now the very people who had once supported him were turning their backs. His power, built on lies and prejudice, had crumbled in the face of truth. The family stood tall, watching as Greg's arrogance deflated, and the neighbors who had once been silent now rallied around them. It wasn't just about the confrontation. It was about the larger victory over hate and division. The family had proven that truth and unity could overcome even the most deeply ingrained prejudices. The confrontation at the gathering didn't end with Greg's public humiliation. In fact, it was just the beginning of a wave of change that spread across the entire neighborhood. As the truth came to light, it became clear that the family's strength in standing up to Greg's lies had sparked a larger transformation. The next morning, the local community bulletin board was filled with messages of support for the Black family. Many neighbors, who had previously been influenced by Greg's lies, now came forward, offering their apologies and expressing regret for their actions. The neighborhood, once divided by Greg's false accusations, began to unite. People who had once kept their distance now welcomed the family with open arms. But the biggest shock came when the neighborhood's homeowners association called for a special meeting. At the gathering, several community leaders addressed the elephant in the room: the damage Greg had caused with his lies. "We can no longer allow divisiveness to tear us apart," one of the leaders said. "We must come together, acknowledge the truth, and rebuild the trust that has been broken." It became clear that Greg's actions were part of a much larger issue of unspoken racial bias within the community. The neighborhood had been comfortable with surface-level niceties, but no one had ever really confronted the underlying prejudices that existed. Greg's lies had forced the community to take a hard look at the deeper issues they had been ignoring. In the weeks that followed, the Black family became more than just victims of slander. They became advocates for change in their community. Together, they worked with local organizations to hold workshops and seminars about racial bias, fostering an open and honest dialogue about the issues they had faced. They encouraged neighbors to speak out, to stand up for justice, and to confront their own biases. The public outcry over Greg's actions didn't just change the neighborhood. It sent ripples across the entire town. The media picked up on the story, sharing it as an example of how communities can come together to address deep-seated issues of racism. The family's response to the situation was widely praised. Instead of giving in to anger or retaliation, they used their experience as a platform to bring about change and create understanding. As for Greg, the fallout from his actions continued to haunt him. He tried to salvage his reputation by issuing half-hearted apologies, but no one was buying them anymore. His neighbors, who had once seen him as a pillar of the community, now viewed him with disdain. He found himself increasingly isolated, with many of his former allies distancing themselves from him. His credibility was destroyed, and his divisive influence on the neighborhood was no longer tolerated. But despite the public backlash against Greg, the family didn't take any satisfaction in his downfall. They had never sought revenge. Instead, they focused on the larger picture, on how they could help the community heal and grow from this experience. Through their leadership, they helped create a space where neighbors could come together, share their experiences, and learn from each other. The family continued to host events, organizing community dinners and town hall meetings, encouraging people to get to know each other beyond the surface level. Slowly, the trust that had been broken started to rebuild. The true victory wasn't in Greg's downfall or the public shaming he faced. It was in the transformation of the neighborhood. What had started as an attempt to silence and divide a family had turned into a moment of growth and self-awareness for the entire community. People began to realize that assumptions, prejudice, and bias didn't belong in a neighborhood that prided itself on its sense of unity. The neighborhood was no longer the same. It had changed for the better, and the Black family had played a pivotal role in that change. They had turned a painful situation into a powerful opportunity for education, growth, and healing. They had shown everyone the power of standing up against injustice and using one's voice to foster change. But the story didn't stop there. The family's efforts to push for social justice didn't fade with time. They used their experiences to continue advocating for broader reforms, working with schools, community centers, and local businesses to ensure that the lessons they learned weren't forgotten. The moral of the story was clear. When faced with prejudice and false accusations, it's not about retaliation or revenge. It's about rising above and using the truth as a force for change. The Black family's grace and dignity in the face of adversity had shown the community that standing together against racism was the only way forward. As time passed, the community began to heal. The toxic seeds that Greg had planted in the neighborhood were slowly uprooted by the collective efforts of the Black family and the neighbors who chose to confront the uncomfortable truths that had been hiding in plain sight. What had initially seemed like an insurmountable challenge, being targeted, isolated, and belittled, turned into a moment of empowerment, not just for the family, but for everyone who stood alongside them. The family didn't just let the incident fade away. They understood that true change wasn't about letting things go back to normal. It was about creating a new normal. With each workshop they hosted, each open discussion, the community grew stronger. People were learning not just about racism, but about how to support one another when confronted by injustice. It became clear that healing would only come through honest conversations and the willingness to do the work of understanding each other's struggles. The family's influence in the neighborhood deepened. Neighbors who had previously been hesitant began to step forward, sharing their own stories of prejudice and recognizing how they had inadvertently contributed to the division. Some admitted that they hadn't noticed how the biases around them had shaped their perspectives, but they now wanted to learn, to grow, and to become part of the solution. This was no longer just the story of one family overcoming adversity. It was a story of a whole community evolving into a better, more inclusive space for everyone. For the Black family, their sense of belonging grew stronger, not in spite of the challenges they faced, but because of the way they handled those challenges. Instead of becoming bitter or resentful, they had shown that strength comes from resilience, from refusing to let the hatred of others define your place in the world. They had done the hard work of standing tall and facing adversity head-on, but they had also done the harder work of offering grace to a community in need of healing. The public's perception of the family had completely shifted. What had started as whispers and accusations, fueled by ignorance and prejudice, had now transformed into admiration. The family had become role models, not just for their neighborhood, but for others facing similar struggles elsewhere. They proved that standing up for what's right doesn't always require a fight. It requires a steady, unwavering commitment to truth and dignity. Greg, on the other hand, was left to face the consequences of his actions. The damage to his reputation was severe. He found himself isolated, not just from the Black family, but from much of the community that had once supported him. His attempts to apologize came too late. The damage to his credibility was irreversible, but in an odd way, it was his behavior that had sparked the change. His actions, fueled by deep-seated bias, had inadvertently illuminated the fractures in the community. And those fractures, once exposed, were addressed with open conversations and action. Over the months that followed, Greg's name was scarcely mentioned. The focus shifted to the growth that had emerged from the ashes of the controversy. People had learned that racism, when confronted head-on, could be overcome. What mattered more now was the collective effort to make sure that something like this didn't happen again. The family's continued activism had a ripple effect beyond their neighborhood. They began working with local organizations, pushing for broader societal changes, particularly within schools and workplaces, where racial prejudice often went unchecked. They focused on empowering the younger generation, teaching them the importance of standing up for each other, regardless of race, background, or appearance. It wasn't just about one neighborhood anymore. It was about making sure the lessons learned here reached far beyond. Despite everything they had faced, the Black family knew that their victory wasn't in making Greg pay for his lies. It was in the collective growth of the community. It was in seeing their neighbors, who once felt powerless to speak up, now use their voices to call out injustice. It was in watching a community, fractured by hate, come together in solidarity. Through their actions, the family demonstrated that one person's courage could create a ripple effect that spreads far beyond their own life. They were living proof that standing firm against prejudice, without sinking into anger or bitterness, could ignite a broader movement. They had shown that, while hate may still exist, it could be defeated by the quiet power of truth, compassion, and unity. In the end, the neighborhood wasn't just healed because of what the Black family had done. It was healed because everyone had learned to see past the labels, the stereotypes, and the lies. They had come together to fight the real enemy, ignorance and fear. And by doing so, they created a stronger, more inclusive community where everyone truly belonged. The journey that started with false accusations and racial bias ended with a community stronger and more united than ever before. The Black family's ability to stand firm in the face of adversity, not with anger, but with grace and dignity, changed everything. They had transformed a painful experience into a catalyst for progress, sparking difficult but necessary conversations about race and inclusion. What began as a small ripple of discrimination turned into a wave of change, one that reverberated far beyond their neighborhood. This story reminds us that we all have the power to stand up against injustice. It shows us that the truth, even when it's difficult, is the most powerful weapon we have in the fight against prejudice. And most importantly, it teaches us that unity is stronger than division. When a community comes together to support one another, there is no room for hate. Now, it's your turn. Have you ever witnessed or experienced racism or prejudice? How did you handle it? What steps can we all take to create a more inclusive and understanding world? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We want to hear from you. If this story inspired you, like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories of courage, resilience, and change. Together, we can create a world where respect and fairness are the foundation for all. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for more stories that challenge the status quo and inspire us to do better.